At this time, for the purpose of an introduction, I'd like to have the commander of the VFW, Stan Grela, come forward.
Thank you again. What a great opportunity, an infantry officer introducing an infantry officer. Roger King, a native Texan, joined the Defense Military Activity, the DMA, in August 2009 as the Chief Corporate Communications. He was moved to the current position on 1 June 2010, directing all support and requirements for the organization and serving as the staff coordinator for the DMA. The DMA is a global communications arm of the Department of Defense, providing television, radio, news, entertainment support to troops deployed overseas and ships at sea. The DMA also collects and maintains operational imagery for the department and provides web content management services to more than 500 defense websites. Before coming to the DMA, Mr. King served as a strategic communications consultant with Bos Allen Hamilton, assisting in the Office of Surgeon General in the United States Medical Command. Mr. King served 34 years in the U.S. Army, starting as an enlisted journalist. He was commissioned as an infantry officer upon graduation from the Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning, Georgia in 1978. Mr. King had a variety of positions as an infantry officer, from leading a platoon in the 101st Airborne Division to serving as Chief of Staff of a multi-component brigade in the 75th Division Training Support. He also served as a public affairs officer on assignment around the world, including the search for unaccounted for service members throughout Southeast Asia and a joint task force full accounting. He served combat tours in Operation Desert Storm and in Afghanistan, where he was a spokesman for the coalition forces in 2002 and 2003. Mr. King culminated his military career as the Director of Public Affairs for the U.S. Army Forces Command. He retired as a colonel. His military decorations include the Legion of Merit with 2 oak leaf clusters, the Defense Meritorious Service Medal, the Bronze Star Medal, and the Combat Infantry Badge, and a number of other awards. Mr. King has a Bachelor of Science from Excelsior College in New York and a Master of Military Art and Science from the United States Army Command and General Staff College. He is married to the former Mary Schaefer of Seneca Falls, New York, and they have 3 grown children. At this time, Roger King.
Thank you very much, Stan. I appreciate that. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, friends and family, thank you for allowing me to address you here today on the 149th anniversary of the solemn celebration that calls Waterloo, New York home, Memorial Day. When I was first asked to speak at this ceremony, I was talking about it with someone that you may know, Dave Dupre over here, and I protested to him that I didn't have any special qualifications to be considered for this honor. I'm not famous. I don't have a long string of letters after my name that says that I went to a lot of schools. I'm not a hero. I'm not endowed by my battlefield exploits with anything that would allow me to speak for the people that we honor today. But it was pointed out to me that I had the great good fortune to marry into the Finger Lakes, so to speak. And I did that by winning the hand of my lovely wife, Mary. She's a Schaefer from Seneca Falls, which really means something up here in the Finger Lakes. And so while I might not have the strongest connection to the home of Memorial Day, I can claim that I wouldn't exist without Memorial Day. And to explain that, I have to tell you a little bit about my personal history. I'm a child of the Southwest, growing up in Texas, as was noted earlier, but my mother is from Oklahoma, and that's where this story would take us. The people and the veterans of the Union honored their Civil War dead through Memorial Day, and over time it became a national rather than a sectional observance. In the South, it was referred to almost exclusively as Decoration Day. It was a day for decorating the graves with flowers. And in the rolling hills of eastern Oklahoma, there's a small crossroad hamlet named Arpeller. It's basically a general store, a church, and a cemetery. Nobody really lived there. They all lived out in the countryside. And I don't even think the store is still standing, but the church and the cemetery remain. And in the early 1900s, it was the custom of that community that the boys and girls from the surrounding farms would bring buckets and wash tubs to this cemetery, and they would pair up and go out into the hills and the meadows, and they would pick wildflowers. And then they would come back and decorate the graves of the veterans. So on Decoration Day in 1912, my grandfather, a man named, or at the time, a boy named Alva Barnhill, grabbed one handle of a wash tub, and my grandmother, Voisey Donaldson, grabbed the other handle. And they were 12 years old at the time. And apparently, when they looked into each other's eyes, they saw potential. And eventually, they saw love because they were married when they were 18, and they stayed together the rest of their days. So I can claim a direct link to Memorial Day through my grandparents. And it's fitting that I start with today with what is essentially a love story, because if you want to understand how I feel about Memorial Day, you have to think of it in terms of love and in terms of potential. My Army career took me all over the world, in and out of combat zones, through dangerous training, and into areas where there were diseases that were too nasty to think about. I've gone to combat and come home to my family. And I've gone to the scenes of past combat to sift through the wreck and rubble of battle to try to help return the remains of the fallen to their families. I've been blessed to stand in times of peace on the battlefields at Gettysburg and Antietam, the beaches at Normandy and at Anzio, and the hills above Hue in Vietnam, places that cause the hair on the back of your neck to stand up because you can imagine all too well what went on there during time of war. And what does any of this have to do with love? The people we honor today ended up in those places because of love. Many joined the military for something as simple as love of country, some simply because they felt they had to. But we're not commemorating because they went. We're commemorating them because of their sacrifice while they were there and the sacrifice involved in not coming back. People often ask if death in a war was worth it, and they couch this sometimes in terms that are political, linking it to the war itself. In this instance, I think taking a larger view is wrong. Each death is an individual act, all the more important for the person dying. But families and friends ask, was it worth it? Or they worry, did my loved one die in vain? And in the larger view, I can't answer that question. History often takes decades to lead us to even a general conclusion about the rightness or wrongness of our actions in a war. But I think at least I can point to an answer on the smaller, more personal view of the question. And the answer I would point to lies in you, and it lies in me. Writers and poets in the past have evoked romanticized reasons for bravery and sacrifice in battle. A gentleman named Lord Macaulay was a British poet. He wrote a series of narrative poems in the 1800s about ancient Rome. And one of the most famous stanzas from those poems describes a Roman officer who sent his troops to safety while he stayed behind on what could have been a suicide mission. And Macaulay wrote, "And then out spoke brave Horatius, the captain of the gate. To every man upon this earth death cometh soon or late. And how can a man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods?" And even more famously, a Canadian major in the Army named John McCrae wrote a poem closely associated with both Veterans Day and Memorial Day here in the United States called In Flanders Fields. And using the voices of those killed in battle, he called for further martial action, saying, "If you break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields." So Macaulay would have troops die for the memory of ancestors and for tradition. And McCrae has the dead giving us a call to action, hinting that by continuing a war, we confer greater value on the deaths. And that may be comforting, but I think that there's more to it. When troops are wounded in combat, they often want to know about their buddies, their team. But when the wounds are grave, their thoughts and cries go to family. Their concern in extremity is most often for those they love. They may have joined for love of country, they may have served for love of flag or unit or honor or comrades. But they died filled with the love of family or home. They died for the life their loved ones get to live. And that's where potential comes into the equation. When you love somebody or something, you see and appreciate what is, but you also imagine and appreciate your vision of what could be. When my grandfather looked across that wash tub into the bright blue eyes of the young lady holding the other handle, he started thinking about the future. And I'm sure all of you have done the same thing from time to time, whether it's about a person or a piece of land or a home or a car. You see the object of your desire and you picture yourself in relation to that object in the future. In your mind, you construct a moment. You share a dinner, you build a house, you remodel a home, you drive with the top down. You glimpse the potential of your life. I believe the sacrifice of those we honor today was offered in love to ensure our potential lives. There was a movie several years ago that affected me deeply. It was called Saving Private Ryan. And lots of the commentary about the movie focused on the realism of the opening scenes of the battle on the beaches at Normandy. As an infantry soldier, I was both moved and shaken by that depiction. But the part of the movie that endured for me was the ending. And I don't know how many of you saw the movie, or of those of you who did, whether or not you remember the ending. But the closing scene depicts an older man surrounded by his family, standing in a cemetery, looking down at the tombstone of a soldier who died to save that older gentleman many years before. And he turns to his wife and he says, "Tell me I've led a good life. Tell me I'm a good man." I noted earlier that death is an individual act. And the scene I just mentioned was an individual response to a particular sacrifice. But it points to the answer I alluded to earlier, the answer to the central question of Memorial Day. Were the deaths we commemorate worth it? And I say again that the answer is in you and in me. I believe that Memorial Day calls us to measure ourselves against our potential. It calls us to measure ourselves against their sacrifice. They died for the love of an idea of us, that we might live as free Americans in a future they could only imagine. We are living their future. So the question for Memorial Day shouldn't be, was their death worth it? But rather, am I worth their death? It's a question I ask myself, and I'm often disappointed with the answer, but I keep trying. I came home from my wars, and many of you out in the audience came home from your wars, but they sacrificed for me, and they sacrificed for you, they sacrificed for all of us. So I would encourage all of you, as you observe Memorial Day, strive to live up to the potential they died to ensure, so that the lives we live guarantee that their sacrifice was worth it. Thank you, and may God continue to bless America.